This is Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark MacDonald.
You're surrounded. Those plastic bags, that plastic water bottle, that polyester shirt, that cardboard box, that wooden chair, that cotton dish rag, and that paperback novel. They're all polymers of one kind or another. Polymers are taking over the world. Just about everything you see around you is made of polymers, from the paint on the walls to the carpet on the floor. Oh no! Even I'm made of polymers! What should I do? Step 1 is to not panic. And step 2 is to listen to an entertaining podcast episode about what polymers are, what they're made of, and what we can do about them. This episode is about the class of molecules called polymers. A polymer is a very large molecule made of a long chain of smaller repeating units, and this chain structure gives materials made out of polymers some very useful properties. It makes them strong, light, cheap, and just as stiff or bendy as you want. So let's do a deep dive into the world of polymers, the molecules that make the modern world possible. Part 1. What is a polymer? The word polymer comes from Greek, where poly means many and mer is short for mermaid. When many mermaids get together and hold hands, it forms a long chain that we call a polymer. That is, if the mermaids are metaphors for small molecules, and holding hands is a metaphor for chemically bonding to each other. So actually, a polymer is a bunch of small molecules that bond together to form long chains, and these long chains are called polymers. And also, the mermaid thing was a joke. Real mermaids are actually much larger than molecules. Polymers come in two types. There are natural polymers and artificial polymers. You might recognize the names of some of the natural polymers. DNA, the molecule that holds the instructions that tell your body how to grow, is a polymer. Cellulose, the material that gives support and structure to plants, is a polymer. Proteins, the molecular machines that make your body run, are polymers. Natural polymers have been around for as long as life has. But artificial polymers are new. 1907 was when the first fully synthetic plastic was invented, and since then, plastics have become so widespread that it's become hard to imagine a world without them. Plastics are an important type of synthetic polymer, so let's spend some time introducing them. The word plastic means capable of being shaped or molded. Plastic is bendy, especially when it's being manufactured. By the way, the phrase plastic explosives doesn't mean that the explosives are made of plastic. It means they're made of a putty that can be shaped or molded, though there are polymers in plastic explosives. Also, the phrase plastic surgery doesn't mean the doctors put plastic in your body. It means they mold a part of your body into a new shape, though the stitches are often made of polymers. But the material that makes up water bottles and sporks is called plastic because it's easy to shape and mold during the manufacturing process. And these types of plastics definitely are made of polymers. So, polymers are molecules that come in long chains, and plastics are an important type of polymer. Here are some other things that are made of polymers. Paper and cardboard and wood and cotton are mostly cellulose, which is a natural polymer. Wool and silk and fingernails and hair are made of proteins, which are polymers. Rubber, styrofoam, polyester, actually it would almost be easier to list off the things that aren't polymers and remember those instead. Metal, glass, concrete, stone, and ceramics, like what your toilet's made out of, aren't polymers. So the polymers haven't completely taken over the world. Yet. But they sure are trying hard. Part 2. What are polymers made of? The answer is monomers. Polymers are made of monomers. A monomer is the name of any small molecule that, when you string a bunch of them together, forms a polymer. As an example, let's look at the polymer called polyethylene. Polyethylene is the most widely used plastic in the world. Polyethylene is made of building blocks called ethylene, which is just 2 carbon atoms and 4 hydrogen atoms arranged in a certain way. So you take this little tiny ethylene molecule, just 6 atoms large, and you put it in a tank at high temperature and pressure, and add another chemical called an initiator to get you started. The initiator will steal an electron from the ethylene. Then the ethylene molecule with a stolen electron bumps up against another ethylene molecule, and the two will bond together. You've formed the beginning of a chain. Now, you bump the end of the chain against another ethylene molecule, and the chain starts growing. Keep going for another couple hundred molecules, and you get a long chain of polyethylene. A bunch of these chains tangled together are what make up your plastic milk jugs and your toy dinosaurs. Not all molecules can string together into chains like this, but by now we've found a bunch of them that can form polymers. Here are some other synthetic polymers you might have heard of. If you take a monomer called styrene and string a bunch together, you get polystyrene, which is what the takeout boxes at Panda Express are made of. If you take a monomer called vinyl chloride and string a bunch together, you get polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, which is what the pipes in your sprinkler system might be made of. Take a monomer called tetrafluoroethylene and string a bunch together and you get polytetrafluoroethylene, also known as Teflon. In general, to name a polymer, if you take the name of the monomer and add poly to the beginning, you get the name of the polymer. By the way, once the monomers come together to form a chain, they aren't called monomers anymore. They're just called mers. If you think of polymers as long chains, or as worms, or ropes that tangle up with each other, that will get you pretty far, but it won't get you all the way to understanding them. One of the things that makes it more complicated is that chemical reactions aren't always straightforward, and sometimes side reactions make it so the chains branch off, so the polymer molecule looks more like a tree branch than a worm. If you have a lot of branching, then the chains can't pack together as tightly, and this makes the polymer less dense and more bendy. Straight chains can pack together more densely and make a stronger and more rigid material. But branching isn't the only thing that affects the properties of a polymer. It also matters how long the chains are. Short chains don't stick together as strongly, which makes the material more flexible. Longer chains are more likely to tangle up and stick together, which makes the material more rigid and strong. So if you need flexible, you want to use short chains with lots of branches. Well, if you need strong and rigid, you want long, strong chains. Two final notes about synthetic polymers. First, cross-linking. Sometimes you can do things to the polymer so that different chains bond to each other. This is what happens to rubber to make it strong. Rubber is normally soft, like an eraser, but if you cross-link the chains together, you can make it strong so that your car's tires last for years instead of flaking off little eraser bits. And second, the way you process the polymer matters a lot. Grocery bags and milk jugs are made of the same type of plastic. The only difference is the way that they process it. Extrusion versus molding, if that means anything to you. Which is kind of wild. Grocery bags and milk jugs seem so different, but they're the same material. So that's synthetic polymers for you, what they're made of and how their structure affects their strength and flexibility. Now let's talk about Part 3, biological polymers. Polymers are the molecules that make life possible. Your body has four main types of large molecules in it. Proteins, DNA plus its cousin RNA, chains of sugars called polysaccharides, and a fourth type of molecule called lipids. The first three are all polymers, and the fourth one has something interesting to teach us about polymers too, so let's look at all four of them. First of all, DNA. DNA is a polymer. It's made of a bunch of smaller molecules chained together into one big long molecule. But instead of only one type of monomer, like we saw with polyethylene, DNA has four different building blocks called nucleic acids, and the order of these building blocks gives you your genetic code. Also, unlike polyethylene, DNA doesn't branch. It forms a straight chain, and it's very, very long and can get tangled up real easily. Each cell in your body only has 46 molecules of DNA. That's right, there are 42 million protein molecules in a cell, and only 46 DNA molecules. That's because DNA molecules are really, really long. If you stretched out all the DNA from one cell, it would be 6 feet tall, taller than I am. I'm only 5'11 and 3/4. Most of the time, the DNA looks like a big, tangled ball of yarn. But when the time comes for the cell to divide in two, it needs to make sure each of the daughter cells gets a copy of each of the DNA molecules. So it untangles the ball of yarn and packs the DNA into sausage-like rods before replicating the strands. DNA strands tangle in the same way you see in synthetic polymers, but your body's figured out how to work with that and get it untangled when it needs to. And that's really amazing that it works out so well. DNA is best known for storing your genetic information, but you can also make things out of it. Scientists have figured out a technique called DNA origami. Just like how in origami you fold a paper to create interesting shapes, in DNA origami you use strands of DNA to make molecule-sized shapes. From my Googling, I wasn't able to find any examples of a DNA crane or swan or frog. The scientists are more interested in things that they can use, like molecule-sized boxes or tubes. But the YouTuber Mark Rober did do a video with some scientists in California who made a DNA origami Nerf gun. Sadly, it wasn't able to fire any bullets, but their paper did mention some ideas about how future versions could actually fire, and in typical scientist fashion, made something up about how these blasters could be used to target cancer cells or pathogens for destruction. Also, according to their paper, there is surely no shortage of ideas of what can be done with DNA origami. There's just a shortage of scientists to execute them. So that's DNA for you. Let's move on to proteins. Proteins are also a polymer. But unlike polyethylene, which only has one monomer, and unlike DNA, which has 4 types of monomers, proteins have 22 different building blocks, called amino acids. These amino acids get chained together, and then the chain folds up into a ball or a blob or some other 3D structure. These 3D structures give the proteins their diverse functions as tiny molecular machines. The shape it ends up folding into is determined by the order of the amino acids in the chain. So, proteins don't exactly look like polymers at first glance, because you're seeing that complex 3D structure. But if you grab the 2 ends and pull really hard, you'd see that they're chains, just like any other polymer. In fact, when you heat proteins up, they can sometimes unbend, because heating things up makes them wiggle around more. They don't usually straighten out all the way, but they lose some of their careful folding. When you cook an egg, the proteins unfold and straighten out, and then they tangle up and stick to each other to form a network, which is why an egg becomes solid when you cook it. It's because proteins are polymers. And now let's talk about polysaccharides. Polysaccharide means many sugars in Greek. It's the same poly as in polymer. Polysaccharides are what you get when you string together a bunch of sugar molecules into a polymer. Why would your body want to do that? Sometimes for storing energy. Bonding sugars together into a polymer chain lets your body store energy more compactly and efficiently. But also, sometimes cells use these polymers as structural components. For example, cellulose. You take a bunch of the most common sugar, glucose, and string them together in the right way, and you get cellulose. Cellulose is said to be the most abundant organic molecule on Earth. It makes up the cell walls of plants, which is a big part of how plants remain stiff and upright. And it's also why you can't digest celery strands. It's because it's a bunch of cellulose, and your body can't digest cellulose. Cows can, termites can, koalas and horses can, but people can't. Our bodies are unable to digest cellulose, which I consider a major design flaw. Wouldn't the world be so much better if you could just walk up to a tree and say, "Hi tree, I'm going to eat you." And then you nibble on the bark, and it actually gives you the calories you need to survive. That's the solution to world hunger right there. We should start a petition. I want to talk about one more type of polymer here. We've talked about 3 types of large biological molecules so far: DNA, proteins, and polysaccharides. There's a 4th main type of biological molecule that's not a polymer. They're called lipids, and it's kind of a catch-all category that includes things like fats and oils, among other things. While they're not polymers themselves, there are conditions under which they can form a polymer. And those conditions are all met in cast iron pans. You know how you're not supposed to wash cast iron in the dishwasher? Well, there's a good reason for that. When you cook with cast iron, some of the fats and oils in the pan polymerize and form a coating. The fats all link together into a chain, and the roughness of the cast iron leaves little grooves and stuff for the chain to snag onto, and so the polymers get stuck on the surface and form a coating. This coating keeps things from sticking to the pan, so much that a well-seasoned cast iron pan is just as good or better than a pan with a synthetic non-stick coating like Teflon. Washing the pan in the dishwasher gets rid of this coating, which is why you don't want to do it. So that was biological polymers. Before I continue, I want to make sure you don't misunderstand what I just said. I did not just say that your body is made of plastic. Plastic is a polymer and DNA is a polymer, but that does not mean that DNA is plastic, any more than it means that plastic is DNA. They're different things, but they're both polymers. At a molecular level, they're made of smaller repeating units that form a chain. And in certain situations, scientists can use some of the same type of thinking to study both DNA and plastics. So yeah, biological polymers. Let's keep going. Part 4. Plastic and the environment. Polymers are a very important part of our lives, both very literally, since they're an important part of our biological makeup, and also less literally, in that many of the materials we encounter every day are made of plastic and polyester and other types of polymer. But these synthetic polymers also cause problems. In this section, we're going to focus on plastic. One of the biggest problems with plastic is that it can take hundreds of years to break down naturally, which leads to one really big issue and one really tiny issue. First, the really big issue. There's a whole lot of plastic waste. According to Statista.com, there are 400 million tons of plastic thrown away each year, or the weight of 100 million elephants. That's about 20 times more elephants than currently exist in the world. Only 9% of plastic waste gets recycled. Most of the remainder ends up in landfills, but some of it gets thrown out on the side of the road or makes its way into the river and flows down into the ocean. Plastic pollution is starting to become the norm. You can go out to the middle of nowhere and not be surprised to see a plastic bottle sitting in the bushes. Plastic pollution can even have an impact on Earth's geology. When melted plastic mixes with grains of sand and other natural debris, it makes a lump of rock geologists call plastiglomerate. These plastic rocks are going to stick around for a long time, so some geologists and environmentalists have proposed that these new plastic rocks could be one way to mark a new geological era on Earth, the Anthropocene, the era of humans. Earlier this year, the governing body of geologists, called the International Union of Geological Scientists, voted on whether or not to recognize the era of humans as its own geological period. They voted no. So it's still only an idea for now, but someday I'm confident that the era of humans will be formally recognized by even the geologists, and the plastic rocks are one part of how it will be recognized. About 0.5% of plastic waste ends up in the ocean, but a little bit can build up over time, and that's not a little bit. That's still over 1 million tons per year, which is how we get the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. You know, the collection of floating plastic and trash in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? The one that's twice the size of Texas? Or 3 times the size of France? Yes, Texas is larger than France. Sad French noises. Let's talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Ocean currents make all the trash in the Pacific Ocean come together in one place, and the area where it comes together is called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But it's not the islands of trash you're imagining. Most of the area is just little pieces of plastic too small to see, which make the water look like a cloudy soup. In fact, the garbage patch can't be seen from satellite imagery, and people who go there with a boat or even scuba gear often don't realize they're in the garbage patch. It just looks normal. But occasionally you'll see larger items like fishing gear and toothbrushes floating in the nasty trash soup. And these plastic bits can be fatal if animals eat them or get caught in them. So that was the first big problem, the plastic waste that's building up. Now let's talk about the small problem, which might actually be bigger than the big problem. Microplastics. Microplastics, the tiny little plastic particles that are left over when plastic bags and bottles and stuff fall apart, microplastics are everywhere. They're in the water you drink. They're in the food you eat. They're in the dust in the air. They've even been found in the bottom of the deepest trench in the ocean. Which sounds scary, but so far they've been pretty underwhelming. It hasn't been shown that these microplastics are causing harm, but it also hasn't been tested as carefully as something that civilization altering really should have been. So I file microplastics under the category of probably mostly harmless, but worth looking into and secretly hoping they will give us plastic-themed superpowers instead of cancer. Because what else can you do? At a personal level, you can use reusable bags and buy less single-use plastics. If you're worried about ingesting microplastics, you can put your tap water through a little filter before you drink it, eat less seafood, avoid microwaving things in plastic containers that don't say microwave safe, and dust and vacuum regularly. But I want to focus on a larger scale. What can we, as a society, do to dispose of our plastics better? Part 5. Purging the plastics. We've said that plastics are not biodegradable, and so they tend to last forever. So are we doomed? Is there no escape? Is the destiny of humanity to drown in piles of invincible plastic? I say no! We will stand. We will fight off this polymer invasion. We will not surrender. But how? How do we purge the plastics? I'm going to talk about 4 different ways we've been dealing with this plastic pollution problem. First, we can gather it up and store it in landfills, where it doesn't bother anyone. This is the current strategy in much of the world. Hide it away, hope that future people have better technology to deal with it. Second, we can burn it. Please don't burn plastic in your backyard. It releases toxic smoke that can be dangerous to you and the people around you. But in a large-scale incinerator, they can capture the toxic gases, and it looks like soon we'll be able to capture most of the CO2 released from burning the plastic, but that part will be expensive. So is it better to burn it or let it sit in a landfill? There's a big argument going on about that right now, especially in Europe, and I don't really want to get involved in it, but know that there are trade-offs between having plastic taking up space in a landfill versus burning it and releasing CO2, versus spending a lot of money to capture the CO2 when you burn it. Third, we can recycle used plastic, which is great, and we should do more of it. But not all plastic can be recycled. Also, of the plastics that can be recycled, usually you can only do it 2 or 3 times before they lose their durability. To explain why, let's look at the steps involved in recycling plastic. I'm going to generalize it into 3 steps. Step 1 is to sort the plastic. Some of this can be automated, but more often than not it needs people to do some of it manually. This step is really important because even a tiny bit of PVC can ruin the whole batch if it gets mixed in with other types of plastic. Step 2 is to shred the plastic into little bits. Fun fact, bottle caps are often made from a different type of plastic than the rest of the bottle. But after it all gets shredded, they can separate the bottle plastic from the bottle cap plastic by putting it in water solutions of different densities so that one plastic floats and the other sinks. So you don't need to worry about separating your bottle caps from your bottles when you recycle them. Step 3 is to melt the plastic bits. Some types of plastic aren't very happy when you melt them. Those plastics are a lot harder to recycle. But the ones that do play nice with being melted still have problems. When you melt it, it breaks some of the bonds in the polymer chains and makes them shorter. Recall that shorter chains make the polymer more flexible but less durable. That's why you can only recycle plastic 2 or 3 times. After that, the chains can be too short and the plastic isn't durable enough for most purposes. Another reason you can only recycle plastic 2 or 3 times is that the plastics we use aren't always pure polymer. There are all sorts of additives that are added for coloring or flame resistance or stick resistance or other reasons. And some of these additives are really difficult to separate out. These additives can build up if you recycle plastic too many times and make it weak. So that's the normal way to recycle plastics. There's also a different way called depolymerization, where the polymers are broken down into their individual monomers and then remade from there. This means that chains don't get shorter because you're remaking the chains every time. If we could also find better ways to remove the additives and impurities, then we could potentially figure out how to recycle plastic an infinite number of times. But depolymerization is usually more expensive than just melting the plastics down, so it's not as common. The fourth way to purge the plastics is by eating it. Not you, don't eat plastic. I mean getting bacteria to eat it. Remember how I said earlier that plastic isn't biodegradable? Well, let's talk about that. Wood is biodegradable because there are bacteria and fungi and other decomposers out in the wild that eat wood and break down the cellulose and other polymers into smaller molecules that can be used by other plants and animals. Plastics would be biodegradable in the same way. It's just that there currently aren't any plastic-eating bacteria or fungi. And the only reason there aren't any plastic-eating bacteria or fungi is because plastics are so new. They haven't existed long enough for the decomposers to evolve the ability to eat them. But I am highly confident that eventually plastic-eating bacteria will evolve, and the claim that plastics aren't biodegradable will stop being true. And we don't even need to wait 1,000,000 years for it to happen, because it's already started. In 2016, researchers in Japan found that some of the bottles in a recycling plant were being digested by bacteria, plastic eaters in the wild. The problem is, the current plastic eaters are slow, inefficient, and only digest one type of plastic of the many there are out there. It's a start, but we really want bacteria that can efficiently digest each and every type of plastic. So, should we try to science up some better plastic eaters? There are at least two big problems that we should probably think about first. First, do we actually want plastic to rot? You don't really want your sprinkler pipes to rot, then you'd have to replace them more often. One of the big benefits of plastic right now is that it's resistant to corrosion. So if plastic-eating bacteria escaped into the wild, it could ruin some of our infrastructure. And second, using bacteria to decompose plastic would contribute to climate change. Bacteria can produce methane and CO2, which are both greenhouse gases. So if we use them to clean up our trash, it would also contribute to global warming, which is a trade-off we might not want to make. So maybe instead of using them in the wild, we would want to use plastic eaters in factories to help with recycling, breaking down polymer chains into smaller chemicals that could be used for creating new polymers, or maybe even other things. Like, apparently, vanilla flavoring? Some researchers have been able to use bacteria to turn plastic into vanilla flavoring. You could eat ice cream flavored with bacteria poop. Part 6. Conclusion. Here's a polymer joke for you. My friend said he was going to be a polymer chemist, but it seemed too repetitive. Ha 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 ha. Let's review the principles of polymers that we've talked about today. A polymer is a molecule made of repeating units strung together in a chain. Many modern materials are made out of polymers. Teflon, nylon, polyester, Kevlar, and all the different types of plastic are synthetic polymers. DNA, proteins, cellulose, and starch are all biological polymers. Any really big molecules are usually polymers, because it's hard to make big things without repeating units. DNA forms a very long polymer strand, long enough that if you stretched out the DNA from one of your cells all the way, you could use it to jump rope. Except that it would probably break, and if not, the strand would be too thin to see, so it would look like you're just jumping up and down. Proteins can also be stretched out, and when you heat an egg, the proteins stretch out and link together, which is why a fried egg is solid instead of liquid. Cellulose is a polymer made of a long chain of sugars. Koalas and termites can digest it and turn it back into sugars, but humans can't, and I'm still upset about that. Many synthetic polymers form materials that are easy to shape or mold during the manufacturing process, which is why they're called plastic. These plastics have properties that depend on both the chemical identity of the chains and how long the polymer chains are, and how branched they are. Small branched chains make more flexible polymers, while long straight chains make stronger and more rigid polymers. Plastics often get a bad rap, pun intended, but they're a cornerstone of our modern society, and the world would be very different without them. Microplastics are maybe harmless, but we don't know for sure yet. Polymers cause environmental problems, but we're working on ways to fix that, including getting better at recycling and making new plastic-eating bacteria. These problems have some interesting science behind them. I'm not recommending that you drop everything and become a plastic crusader, but I do think it's important for people to have the scientific background to understand the types of trade-offs that surround the issues of plastic. Alright, one last plastic joke. What do you call a young sheep covered in plastic? Laminated. Thanks for listening, and come back next time for more science. Peace.
This has been Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark McDonald.